Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the singer-songwriter, author and music journalist. It is the one and only Paul Roland, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry and all the other groovy stuff. So this is the interview with Paul. I will put links in the notes below of his various websites. He's got one on music and one as an author. And yes, there's a lot to discover. Anyway, this is the interview with Paul. So after several minutes of interest and slightly casual chat, we get down to the exciting subject that was the early formative years. Paul, it's over to you.
Well, initially, as a child, my mother would have Housewife Choice on or whatever, and you would hear these, sort of songs like Tom Jones and all this popular stuff. You rarely heard any pop, any real pop, as I would call it in those days. And I remember the first thing that really stuck with me was there was a song on the soundtrack of the Clint Eastwood film Kelly's Heroes, which appealed to me for some reason. They're called Burning Bridges. I think it just had that sort of sentimental, slightly melancholy feel to it. Perhaps that's what appealed. And there was the theme tune actually also for the Alamo, the John Wayne film, which was I think it's called Green Leaves of Summer, if I remember rightly. That was another sort of melancholy, elegiac kind of a lost era tune that stuck with me at a very early age. But I wasn't so much into music. I used to sing songs in the back of the car, so I was obviously into jolly musicals and sort of things, just as a sort of sing-along thing. Obviously, yes. Music in that way, but I didn't know anything until I would say I missed the Mark Bolan period, funnily enough. So it would have been about 73 when he was, off the boil. But I was certainly aware of glam rock. In fact, I think the first thing I saw of a real thing, I remember I saw Top of the Pops at a friend's house, and it was Elton John singing Crocodile Rock.
Right.
That was the first serious thing. And somebody had played me Starman by John, I'm Only Dancing, actually, it was by David Bowie. And took me to a disco. I must have been, I don't know, 11 or 12. And I heard Silver Machine by Hawkwind and Luke D. Love by I can't remember who. So that was beginning to stir things up a bit. But I wasn't listening and buying records until a couple of years later. And as you said, prog was like parallel universe at the time, wasn't it? So you were either into glam or you were into prog, if you like, if you were a teenager. And one of my friends was rather sort of pretentious, so he was into prog and played me ELP, which I wasn't so keen on, Brain Salad Surgery. But yes, I got into, as we used to say at the time, this album takes a good few plays before you get into it. It's a very serious.
What was the Yes album, by the way? Because there was which
Fragile.
one?
Fragile would have been the one that he lent me, I remember. But then the first one I bought, I think, was the double Tales from Topographic Ocean.
Oh my God, you went straight. Yeah. So Fragile has on the side. Is that the one with Heart of the Sunrise?
That's right.
Because that
long
is
distance run around and everything, yes.
But the Heart of the Sunrise has this kind of it's 10 minutes, isn't it? And 8 minutes of lots of doodling, and then the lyrics come in, and it's just a poetic kind of moment of ecstasy, and it just all comes together, doesn't it, really? That's such a beautiful song, really.
It is, but I couldn't relate to that because I couldn't imagine how they constructed it. So it was a mystery to me. It's like painting or film. How do they make it? And then I happened to get a second-hand copy of Creedence Clearwater Revival. Can't remember which one it was, but it has them standing in a sort of bayou. It's probably Green River or something like that. And I could hear the chords changing in the background. They were very simple songs, of course, sort of country rock, as you know.
Yes.
And I thought, that's how it's done. You learn a few chords and you sing over the top. And so the first thing that I really attempted was I was writing sort of Mark Bolan influenced poetry, if you like, because he had a book of poetry out called The Warlock of Love, and it was all seemed very profound to us 12-year-olds. It was a complete word salad, but really nonsensical. But at the time, it was incredible, and he used wonderful words, but they didn't make sense. And so I would as a 12-year-old sitting in my class, scribbling my own profound poetry. And one day my friends were playing, in fact, the one who lent me Fragile, his brother was a musician, had guitars hanging on the wall, and my friend played the bass. And we thought it was a great game. That's how it started, a game to play at music, if you like. So, they knew a couple of chords, another friend knew a couple of chords, he strummed on the guitar, my friend played the bass. I banged around on some, homemade percussion and sang my lyrics, as I thought. And even though it was a game, at the end of that afternoon, I felt some door had been opened. And that was a profound moment. I thought, this is an art of infinite possibilities. I didn't know any chords. I didn't have a guitar, but I thought, I'm going to get into this. This is something amazing here.
God, that's amazing, isn't it? And how old were you at that stage?
I must have been about 14, maybe a bit younger. And I started to play. I remember the only thing I had in my house was a plastic ukulele, and I learned, whatever kind of popular songs you had. And I thought, this is ridiculous because it wasn't chords; it was picking out the notes of the melody. I thought, if this is music, it's too much of a struggle. It's too much like hard work. I don't want to learn something. I want to play at it. So eventually, I saw an electric guitar in a shop window, and I remember this was the night that we went to the cinema to see. Now, what was it called? The Paul Newman film with Redford. I can't remember. It was
Butch Cassidy.
No, it was the next one with a ragtime theme.
Oh, was it with Marilyn Monroe?
No. Redford. Never mind. What's his name? Redford. Oh God, my mind is going.
Was it Robert Redford and who?
And Paul Newman and was it and Robert Shaw? That's right. And it had this famous ragtime, Maple Leaf Rags. I even remember the title of the music, but not the film.
So was it The Sting?
Yes, that's it. It was The Sting. 73 or 74, I think we're talking about.
Yes.
So that's when I got a guitar the first time. But then, of course, I didn't have an amp. This was a white elephant in the room for me. I thought, oh, no. I thought I could just, play it and it would come out sounding like Alice Cooper or something, which I loved at the time. I had School's Out. I bought a copy of that.
Yes.
I thought, I can't understand it. I'm playing this thing. I'm hitting the strings. Why doesn't it sound like Alice Cooper? So eventually I had to trade it in for an acoustic guitar, and then we were away. And then I started writing my own songs and recording them on a little cassette. And that was really the start of it. That was 74.
Yeah, 74. So at that stage, you would have been nearly 16, weren't you?
No, I was 14.
14 at that stage. God, I need to do the maths, don't I, really? You were 14. And was it Kent that you were growing up in, by the way?
Yes,
was it
near Canterbury, that's right.
Right, so you were sort of near the vibe of the Canterbury scene, really, at this stage,
yes,
weren't
but
you?
it didn't feel like that because I wasn't aware of it. Remember, I was a schoolboy. So, there were music shops around. It was a very different world. And it was all too much. It was because my friend and his brother were serious. I didn't feel like I could ever be a musician. A musician was something you really had to learn, and I was hopeless at music. With the notes at school in music class. So, and was this imagination, this urge to write. I think was my urge actually to. I wasn't worried about performing or anything. Just I wanted to write music, whether it was song or something else. But I would engage other people, school friends, to play, and they would know chords and they would start playing something. I said, no, go down here or go up here. That was the level I was at that time, guiding somebody else, but it was still creating. And once I heard things coming together, I felt a bit more confident, a bit more encouragement, and I had to shrug off this idea that my friend had. I remember him saying, unless you can play like Eric Clapton, don't bother. That was their attitude. He was only about 14 himself, so he had no. And that really bugged me for many years, I have to say. I felt that if you couldn't play an instrument properly, and of course in those days, this is pre-punk, of course, you had to play an instrument proficiently. And we were talking about Yes and all these other people being the norm, and I thought, God, how am I ever going to... First of all, I can't afford a guitar. Second of all, if I had one, I wouldn't be able to play it. How do you do this magical thing? And yet this burning compulsion was there. And it was only when I had the acoustic guitar, which was a great thing, because if a song sounded great on acoustic, it could only sound better if you then brought in other musicians, I discovered. I mean, I played at a hall where my father was doing some sort of esoteric Buddhist kind of yoga thing, and one of his friends played, I think it was the flute or something, or a recorder. And one day when visiting, he played with me, and I thought, this is wonderful. It sounds like real music. So then that gave me the confidence. I didn't have to learn an instrument. I only had to play the chord and write the songs. And I would find people who had spent years studying and practicing, and they would transform my basic noodlings into real music. And that's basically how I began.
That's an amazing story. That is just fantastic. I mean, did at that stage, were you interested in anything else at school or in life, or was it just literally you had sort of tunnel vision to?
I definitely had tunnel vision because school was a complete waste of time. In fact, only today I was thinking to myself, what was I doing in 1967? I was watching the Monterey Pop Festival, and I was thinking, what was I doing at the time? Why wasn't I in San Francisco? Well, I was a kid in a primary school, and I wouldn't have known, and I wouldn't be able to get there even if I had. But sorry, I've forgotten the question. What was
your tunnel vision? Did you? What was the first gig you went to? Because if you were sort of having these experiences of getting some sound, playing with other people, creating your own, lyrics and singing, what did you go to your first gig and have another kind of moment? Epiphany?
No, I don't think so. From what I can remember, my first gig might have been going to see the prog rock band Griffin at Canterbury University, where my father took me along, but that was just that impressed me from their musicianship, which again wouldn't have done my confidence any good. I mean, it was a wonderful experience, but I thought, crikey, these guys can really play. So that one, and then a couple of years later, I think it must have been about 75. I think I saw Mark Bolan twice. He came down to the South Coast because he, as I said, gone off the boil, and he was starting up, by playing these low key gigs, to get back into it again. So I managed to see him twice, but that didn't really impress me. The first time I was right at the front and became virtually unconscious by the deafening. It was really incredibly loud. And then I was up in the balcony the second time, and I looked down and I thought, oh, is that Mark Bolan that I'm so obsessed with? It doesn't seem to, impress me as much as the records. Being in the presence of somebody. I mean, if I'd been in the dressing room, I think I would have been overawed. But to see him on stage, it was like, oh yeah, there's Mark Bolan. It wasn't it was a bit disappointing. So
yes.
I was never really into gigs, I think is what I'm trying to say. And then later, I started to work for the music press, Kerrang and Sounds, and I had to go to gigs, but they were never first class. There were I remember Ten Pole Tudor and Fad Gadget and people like that. A Flock of Seagulls I remember going to see. So there were bands that I wouldn't have gone to see myself, except one time when I was the editor of Kerrang, I went to see Ozzy Osbourne, and I actually met him because I was the editor under the Wembley Arena. And I said, I'm recording my first album very shortly. Have you any advice? And he said, well, keep away from bloody record companies. So he used another word.
So what do you mean? So
yes.
So when you got to 16, did you take your CSE O levels at that stage and leave school? Were you gone? That was it. You were off.
Well, you had to. I mean, it was like a prison. I always thought that. And when you asked me earlier about 1967 or whatever in school, that's what I remember. That it was absolutely useless. It did nothing but pass the time. It didn't leave me with anything. It didn't teach me anything. I mean, I've become an avaricious reader, is that the right word?
Yes.
Compulsive reader since in adulthood. But at the time, I was too lazy to read anything but horror comics. And school, I can't remember. I was good at English, but that was a sort of natural facility with words that I was gifted with. But other than that, it was absolutely hopeless. And it must have been very soul destroying for a lot of people who ended up, doing very mundane jobs.
Yes, well, it's often when I was at that age in my sort of background, people were going into factories or factories, basically factories, or working on the land as kind of on farms doing some horrible job, killing time, basically. But there was no, I mean, the careers teachers at those days were few and far between. And obviously it must have been a cushy job, because they must have just said, oh, just go to a factory. Oh, you can go to a factory. You can go to live on a farm. Oh, you just have babies and be a wife. That was kind of probably it. It was probably quite a nice
I wasn't given that option of being a wife, so I had to find something else.
Yes.
My parents shunted me off to an advertising agency in London, funnily enough, which I was equally hopeless at. They would ask me to go down into the archives and fetch such and such a file, and I could never find it. They must have thought I did it doing this deliberately, but it wasn't. I just couldn't. I don't know. I was wired differently, I suppose.
Yes. So I was going to say, what was your father's background? Because you said he had a sort of, did you say esoteric quality to him, or?
Well, he had an esoteric interest. He would study alternative religions. He was looking for spiritual enlightenment, if you like, and he gave me a very good attitude towards that. He didn't teach me anything, but he gave me a good attitude towards that, and that it was a positive thing. It was nothing to be feared. There's no. I wanted to take the sensationalism out of the supernatural when I started to write my books about the esoteric, and I was practicing myself. I had out-of-body experiences as a child, so this became very natural to me, and that's why I was writing songs with a paranormal theme, often, not exclusively, but often. That was a sort of, I wouldn't say an obsession of mine, but a preoccupation of mine. So it was natural. I had these experiences. My father was interested in this. I wasn't discouraged, and nobody put any fear into me. Oh, I wouldn't do that. It's against God or the devil or what have you. Although I did have one scary experience, because I tried to force an out-of-body experiences when I was awake, thinking you can do this at will, because it happened during sleep as a natural phenomenon. And at the time, The Exorcist had been released, and I'd seen a documentary when they were trying to exorcise a demon, supposedly, from somebody, and they were in convulsions, and it was a very scary thing for a teenager to see. So when I was trying to, lying on the floor, trying to get myself out of my own body, I obviously feared, what might be out there. And that put a stop to that until I was in my late 20s, I think, when it started to happen again naturally, spontaneously. And so I suppose these things are in parallel, coming from a home where esoteric experiences were naturally talked about, not as something weird.
Yes.
And I had experiences myself, also took the fear out of it, that I knew there was no point wondering if there was life after death, or if there were such things as ghosts, because I'd done it myself more than once. So I wanted to know what it signified. So I had this hunger, this curiosity to know what these experiences signified, and what I could do further in that light, safely, of course. So I joined a healing circle much later, and I thought, if I'm in company like that, it'll be a positive experience. There's nothing to fear. There's people there who know what they're doing, and they're all there for the good of everybody, for the benefit of everybody. It's not about egos, a magical circle or a witchcraft circle or whatever. So that went hand in hand with the music, I suppose, the two things together. And that's why I've written a lot of songs, some quite wistful and whimsical, and not too serious, putting down larger than life characters like Crowley and other folks. But at the same time, there is a seriousness, but I don't want to put too much serious topics into my music, because it sounds like you're preaching or something, and it comes across like some sort of very poor heavy metal band. There has to be something slightly funny and knowing in my lyrics, so that people get something different from my lyrics than they would from simply slapping on the name Edgar Allan Poe or Reanimator. So, dare I say, a metal, the conventional metal band would do. I don't want to name anybody. So I take a different slant, and I come from this esoteric background. So I know what I'm talking about, but at the same time, I'm not pushing any agenda or trying to be overly dramatic. And that's why I'm surprised that the metal audience likes my stuff, because I would have thought that they would think me too lightweight or too comical or whatever, but clearly not, because I've played the Danish Metal Festival twice now, and that was a great success, and really showed me that having a very diverse range of songs is not a disadvantage. Yes, it might have meant that I've gathered my audience steadily and slowly, more slowly than if I'd said I am this and I targeted a certain audience. But it means that I have longevity, I think, or it seems to be evident to me that people discover me and then they stay with me. But it's hard to discover me because I'm this little handmade chocolate shop down a side street and not on the high street blazing saying I am this genre, I am this category. You know, I'm harder to categorize. But once you find me, I think you find there's more to me than your standard.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, just I was kind of curious. Did you get into kind of things like earth magic though, and then ley lines and sort of?
No, I wasn't into that. I did write for some of those sort of magazines. I wrote about UFOs and so on, and I did a book called Investigating the Unexplained. But I was much more interested in the supernatural, and I got very serious about Kabbalah. I wrote several books about Kabbalah, and I developed and created the Kabbalah cards. So it was quite, I won't say deep, because I always took a very common sense approach to these things. I know that sounds like a contradiction in terms, the esoteric and common sense. But to me, the supernatural is simply an extension of the natural world. The same laws apply. It's not something that's illogical or irrational. And so if you want to know the laws of the universe, how the universe works, if you like, you simply have to look at nature, which is an expression of it, and yourself. You know, the same laws apply. And that logical thing I found in the Kabbalah. I've written about it in a very simple way. I've simplified it, I suppose, while not losing the richness of it. Obviously, you don't want to demean anything or belittle anything. So, but I've simplified it so that anybody could grasp the principles, the basic principles, and then hopefully they will have experiences which make sense and which they can put in a context.
Right. Oh my God, that's very, yeah. God, that's very prolific actually, the amount of work you've done on this subject, but also haven't completely gone off tangent and either thought there were spaceships or the Earth was flat or the moon was fake, which I have done a few interviews where there's been a couple of people who've had those very strong opinions, which has been like, oh, okay, that's interesting, and have got, you know, the conspiracy theorists are sort of quite prolific at the moment, and some of them used to be in indie bands from the 80s, and it's like, you didn't. So yes, it was quite an interesting couple of hours of being pinned back against the wall while sort of being, you know, as if to say, God, you know, how can you be so stupid, David? You don't think this is just a whole con and the moon doesn't really exist. It's like, okay, so no, I suppose I do think it anyway. So that was that. So look, as you trucked on into, so you mentioned you left school, you went to the advertising agency, not great at archiving or so then how does the rest of that sort of period of the 70s progress for you?
Well, simply I left or was kicked out. I tried to get a job in a record shop, which was my ideal. I didn't think of a recording studio. I should have thought of that. I couldn't get anywhere, and wandering around the West End of London, I came upon I think it was called the magazine shop or something, or vintage magazine shop it was called, and I got a job in there. And one day, in walked a guy who now is the front man of a T-Rex tribute band, calls himself Daniels. Back then, he was John Willans, and he persuaded me that we should stop faffing about and commit to recording a single together. In those days, this is 79, it was fashionable to press your own single. Very exciting time. And I was still not quite confident enough, so we shared, you know, one side each. He wrote one side and played on it. I didn't play on his side. And he played on my side of the single, and we pressed 1,000 and got them out. And I don't think anything happened to it, but if I remember rightly, I took it to Rough Trade. We were very sort of naive as well at the time, because you could do anything there. You could walk into the BBC and talk to John Peel, you know, and of course, being young, you think you know you're immortal and you can do all these things, and nobody's going to say no. And you also think what you've done is wonderful, whereas actually it was terrible. But the Jeff Travis of Rough Trade listened, and he said, "Well, to be honest, that's not the sort of thing I want to put out. But you won't have any trouble selling 1,000." And that, to me, was the crucial point. That was somebody who was not my mum and dad or a friend, who's in the business, who knew what they were talking about, saying, "This is valid. It might not be wonderful. It's certainly not for us, and I didn't expect it would be. We were more, mainstream pop, and they were very indie, and
Yes.
but it's remarkable now." And he said, "You won't have any trouble selling 1,000." So the next step was to do an album, but it was me on my own, and in a local studio. It was one of those things where you paid the studio and you pressed up an album and you paid for that as well. But in those days, that was the way to do it if you couldn't be signed by a major. And then you give out review copies, you take them to the radio stations. And I got played by Peel, and I got played by, what was it, Capital Radio in London, Alan Freeman, Fluff Freeman, and all these
Oh,
people.
yes, dear old Fluff. There
That's
you go.
right. So, I think even Peter Powell gave me an honorary mention on Radio 1 and so on. And I was off, and basically, went all downhill from there.
Yes, but then at the same time, yeah. So when you were sort of getting all this together, that took a lot of kind of persuasion, precociousness, and also finance as well. You must have been able to sort of rustle up the.
No. What happened was that I think the studio thought they heard potential, so they said, "We'll put up the studio time, and we'll also press up the albums on credit. You sell them and pay us back the studio time and the album." I think, if I remember rightly, that's the way it was, and it worked out fine. And then Armageddon Records took me on. They had the Soft Boys at the time, and Knox from the Vibrators, and other bands. I can't remember if they're called Half Japanese. I think they had various other people I don't remember. And they'd been recommended by a music journalist, Tom Hibbert, who sadly died quite a few years ago. He'd interviewed me for a magazine, New Music News, I think it was called at the time. And he thought, this is the joke, this is the odd thing, that he had written something very favourable in an interview, and he'd linked it to a Mark Bolan biography that I'd done at the time, a very sort of childish cut and paste, or whatever they call it, scissors and paste job, because I wasn't a real writer then, but I was very enthusiastic about Bolan. So I got all his quotes together from the magazines I've got at the magazine shop, all these things linked, you see. And I had this massive archive, if you like, of interviews from all the major press, the music papers, which nobody would have at that time. They would have thrown them out and put fish and chips in them. And so I put a book together from this, and I got a publishing deal. Anyway, so Tom Hibbert did an interview with me as an artist, but also as the author of this Bolan biography. He put the two things together, and he made a very flattering comment in there, which I didn't get at the time. This is the joke. It was only many, many years later that I actually understood what he had said about me. I suppose I was so wrapped up in the fact that there was a printed thing and it was about my Bolan book rather than my music. Anyway, he recommended me to Armageddon, and they put out the album again, but this time with slightly different track listing and a coloured cover. And that's when I was then in the label business, if you want to call it that, and sort of things faltered on from there. Went to Bam Caruso much later, New Rose in France, and a label in Greece, and so on. And then I started to play gigs, but as an acoustic duo with a friend who played electric viola. And then it became, my semi-professional life. But that's how it sort of began. It sort of fits and starts. It wasn't really anything smooth. I wasn't signed by EMI as I'd always dreamt of, but probably just as well, because they would have pushed me to do touring and this and that, and I would have been under so much pressure I couldn't have sat back and written what I have written. That's the way I feel now. I feel at the time, of course, I thought it was a failure if you don't get signed by a major label, and that I wouldn't say pressing records on your own label was a vanity publishing thing, because that only applied to books at the time. It was a legitimate way of doing it, and so many people were doing it that it was just it was efficient, and you had all the control you wanted, and it was fun to go up to London and hand out all these records to the BBC, Capital Radio, the reviewers. You'd walk into Melody Record Mirror, whatever, and they would take them, and you had as good a chance of getting a review or airplay as anybody on EMI or any of the other majors. So at the time, this was just the way you did it. And I was running a fanzine at the time, a Roland fanzine and thing. So the do-it-yourself attitude was fine because it was a do-it-yourself world at the time. It's very different now. And it was very, very shortly after punk. As I say, we're talking about 79, but there was still that ethic, aesthetic in the air. The idea that you could print up little fanzines and hawk them around the King's Road and all that, which I did. I wrote Bowie fanzines and other things. I was obviously, discovering that I could write, if you like. So lyrics.
Yes, it was all coming together. So for music, that moment, there was, as you mentioned, punk, but there was that post-punk moment, and there was goth rock, there was New Paisley, there was lots of the Blitz kids with that new romantic vibe.
Oh yes,
there was another club which was around, which was a bit of a dandy club, which I got a book from the other day. Or what was it? Alice in Wonderland, a club like that. Were you sort of aware of those scenes? Because it sounds like you had your sort of finger on the pulse, sort of.
No, that's not. No, really, because I was living in Kent and I was travelling up every day to London and coming back again. And I'd go to a gig and then I'd come home at like 1 a.m. and I'd walk all the way from the station about 5 miles. But it was great fun. You're walking through these empty streets, no fear of anything. I mean, it was a safe place, but it was that world, and it was great. Sitting on the editorial meetings and all this sort of thing. And I didn't want to live up there. I had a very comfortable life, if I can call it that, down in Kent. So I had the best of both worlds, and I wanted this quiet. I needed this quiet. I wasn't aware of it then, to write my own songs. If I'd lived in a squat and had been struggling, I probably would have made it. I might have caught somebody's ear, but it, I wasn't that kind of a person. I couldn't rough it. And I didn't really want to tour. I didn't want to play live, particularly at the time. So I wanted to sit in my bedroom, a comfortable bedroom, and write my songs, record them on a little cassette, and then go into the studio with local musicians and make my own records. And that was just the life I had. It was a comfortable way of doing it. And I lived in this sort of ivory tower fantasy life. And that's why my songs, certainly in the first, dozen albums or whatever, have this slightly innocence thing where it was a fantasy world that I was living in. I created this fantasy world, this Victorian, Edwardian, historical, slightly supernatural world, and it was an endless crucible of ideas. All I had to do was dip into it. I didn't write about real things. I didn't write about relationships. I didn't write about feelings. I mean, my songs had emotions in that I felt for my characters. So songs about, say, Lon Chaney would be quite emotional in a way to the listener, because I felt people who suffered in life, and the contrast and with other people's real life and so on. So I think that's why those early songs still resonate with people, because they do have an emotional element, but they're not the touchy-feely, my heart's bleeding because you don't love me anymore and all this sort of stuff. I wasn't living that kind of a life, and other people did it so much better. They really did. My thing was a literature thing. It was a literary conceit, if you like. It was partly comics that I remembered as a kid, horror comics, and partly the films I watched and so on. So and my father had been a writer, so I had this literary bent, which I applied with lyrics. So I told little short stories in music, and I also created character sketches, if you like, of either real people like Lon Chaney and Crowley, or fictitious characters. Oh yeah, I had Dr. Cream and people like that, Victorian poisoners and so on. So there was an endless source of material out there which other people didn't seem to be drawing upon. And I wasn't thinking about steampunk because it didn't exist at the time. I wasn't thinking about psychedelia even. I was just an acoustic singer-songwriter who also had a band, so some could be quite rocky and doomy. Because they were horror, they had this gothic element. But at the time, I wasn't thinking about goth either. All these things came later. Steampunk, goth, all these labels, I should say, came later. And I just considered myself a singer-songwriter, but not by any stretch of the imagination a folky. I thought that was something soft, and I didn't want to be that. I wanted to be this rock person, but I happened to play an acoustic guitar.
So you brought out the first album, which was the Werewolf of London, which got well received. And then did you then get managed by the ex-manager of Roxy Music and also June Boland as well?
And his then business partner, June Boland, the widow of Mark Boland, that's right.
How did that come about? Because it's quite amazing. You've got, you're sort of very DIY here, and obviously not getting pushed by a major record label, and yet you get two quite heavyweights. So, did they see some like potential genius, basically their pension plan?
I don't know what they thought of me, but if I remember rightly, I went to Virgin Records. I was what's the word? Hawking myself around the major labels at the time because I'd recorded the first album, so I had some professionally studio recorded tracks. And I went to Virgin, and they said, "Don't sign with us because you'll get ripped off, and you'd have to be." I remember him saying, the A&R guy, "You'd have to be at Elton John's level to then sue Virgin to get your just royalties. Don't come here." He didn't say we're a bunch of crooks, but what he did say was, I think I must have said, I'm looking for a label, I can trust, and all this sort of nonsense, all these principles that I'd had from my dad. And he must have thought, well, this guy is clearly not your average, punk rocker who's going to be fobbed off. So he said, look, I've seen an advert or a notice in Music Week, trade magazine. David Eastaugh and June Boland are looking for artists. And so I sent them a cassette, and I think they had 300 or something cassettes, they told me. And when I sounded on the phone so surprised that they hadn't picked me, they said they'd give it a second listen. And they took me on. But nothing came of it. And eventually they got Squeeze. Later he got Robbie Williams. No, I didn't really have any decent songs. Well, I had Blades of Battenberg from the first album and a couple of others. But an embarrassing title, never mind anything else. And I mean, it sounded like Proto T-Rex. I still like it, but I find it embarrassing. And I can't imagine what the Warner Brothers in New York or something must have thought when he heard it. So I don't blame them at all for not signing me. But at the time, obviously, I was disappointed, disheartened, and I gave up for about 3 years.
Yeah, so was this the point then that you started to concentrate on your music journalism period from kind of 83 to 85?
Yeah, that's right.
And you just slipped into that again. It just doors opened quite easily for you.
Yes, but I suppose if I wasn't able to write, they wouldn't have given. They would only tolerate a certain amount of incompetence, and they obviously saw something in what I had written on spec and published it, and then said, "Oh, well, now we'll give you some reviews and we'll give you some gigs to go to." And I must have been, well, first of all, I was reliable. That's something I hadn't thought of at the time, but in retrospect, part of the reason these people employ you is because they know they can rely on you delivering to the deadline. That you're not one of these people who say, "Oh yeah, I'll do that," and then they don't. They've got plenty of those around. It hadn't occurred to me, not to give them something of exactly the right length by exactly the right day. This was a job, and I did it. But I also was, discovered that I could write, and I got better and better until I was eventually writing books. Quite a few years later, and they paid the same amount for a gig review by Bad Gadget, as I said, as they would for some major band. And they paid the same for 200 words on some nothing indie label artist as they would if, reviewing the latest Dire Straits album. So even though I was disappointed not to get, serious albums that I liked, it was nevertheless good work. And it was, I realized I was lucky to get it and privileged. And it was fun, going to as you can imagine, going up to the music press at that time, being handed a dozen albums, you review them, you get paid, then you sell the albums to Record and Tape Exchange in Notting Hill Gate or whatever. and you have a jolly good time, you know.
Yes, well, that's a perfect. So, what paper or magazine were you writing for at this stage?
Okay, initially it was Sounds, and then it was their sister magazine, Kerrang, but they were in the same building, and I didn't know you couldn't use your real name for both of them. I learned that, as soon as the first review appeared in Kerrang, the Sounds person said to me, "You can't do that." I said, "But it's your sister paper. It's not a rival." "Oh, yes, it is," she says. It might be in the same building, it might be the same publisher. But it's a rival. You cannot write for the same people. I don't know if she then told me just to change my name or if I figured that out myself, but that's what happened. So I continued to write for both of them, but one under the Martin Knight, I think, is the name I chose for Kerrang. You ever see that? And I did some very good interviews. I reviewed the Cars. I interviewed Man of War. I can't remember if they're American or not. So I got some very good compliments from the people I was interviewing because I was a musician. Well, I was then a music. By that time, I was a recording artist. And I asked them serious questions that I wanted to know, and not what's your favorite color, or how many girls have you shagged, or whatever. How many pints have you drunk, or whatever they are. They obviously felt they were talking to somebody who knew what their life was like and what a creative process was like. And I interviewed Keith Emerson and all sorts of interesting people, and eventually the Velvet Underground, the surviving members of the Velvet Underground, except for Lou Reed. I interviewed Nico, Sterling Morrison, and Maureen Tucker at some point. This was for a Sunday newspaper, though. Things started to go from one thing to another. Obviously, having written for certain magazines, that opened the door to others. And I asked them if they would be interested in collaborating with me on an album. By that time, it was Dance Macabre, 1987. They just released the VU album of the unreleased material. And they said yes, to my surprise. And I even got a letter from Sterling Morrison later saying, "Can you give me more time?" Because the tapes were incompatible, the format we had in England that I had to send over. I mean, it's ridiculous. In those days, you sent off this big 2-inch metal reel. It probably cost you about 50 quid in shipping. These days you do it, with a WeTransfer. So that didn't happen. But the very fact that they'd agreed to do it, obviously was building my confidence. But what really gave me confidence actually was a small cassette label called Acid Tapes. I don't know if you've ever heard of them.
God, no.
Alan Duffy was the person behind that, an interesting character, and he put together a compilation on cassette, which I thought wouldn't do anything. From the 2 albums that I'd done by that point, that would be The Werewolf of London, and 5 years later, the mini album Burnt Orchids, which is when I found my voice. And he put together a best of sort of cassette compilation. And that started to get interest from fans in other countries, including in America. And he would phone me up every Friday night and tell me the latest wonderful review I'd got in one of these Australian or American or whatever it was magazines. That really started to give me momentum and made me feel, what I was doing was interesting, and people were listening, And
Well, yeah, absolutely. Did you, at that stage, though, with Kerrang, had you become the editor, or were you just writing and reviewing?
I was never the editor of Kerrang. I was the editor of Zigzag. That was my even before I started reviewing, I'd wangled myself into this job as an editor, as a laugh, really, because they'd restarted the magazine. A rich boy had restarted the magazine, so it had nothing to do with the original Zigzag that we all knew and loved back in the 60s. It was really a plaything for this rich fellow, and he had the original editor of Record Mirror working for him temporarily, and he was just leaving, and there was nobody else in the office except this rich guy, the publisher, and me. So I became the editor and chief staff writer. But once I saw that this was a dodgy operation, I left. But I had the kudos of having been the editor for 3 weeks or whatever it was.
Yes. Oh, so you met people like Chris Needs, didn't you?
That's right. Yes.
And then Mick Mercer, the photographer.
I don't remember him. No, I don't remember him. But Chris Needs, I think, was the only journalist that I remember.
Right. And then, so was the editor Paul Kendall?
No. It was Arif Martin at the time. He'd retired, I think, from Record Mirror, and he was doing this as a little job to, help the guy along, and then he left. And I said, could I? Is there anything you'd like me to write? And they said, well, no, but we need an editor now. So I said, well, I'll do that then. I had absolutely no clue how to edit. I obviously knew how to write, so I was writing these things. I didn't know how to design or what have you. Obviously, I knew how to edit copy, but not the proper mechanics. Unfortunately, I'd worked in that damn advertising agency and not in a newspaper. That would have been ideal then, but never mind.
Yes, that's so tricky. So back then into the sort of the writing got put back again, and suddenly you were releasing albums again after. Was it Burnt Orchids was the first one that you came back with?
Yeah, that's right, in 1985, and that was a mini album. And mini albums were fashionable at the time, and I'd used some tracks from a second album that I'd recorded but not released. In November 1980, shortly after the Werewolf. So I had this dumped, whatever you call it, aborted album, and I took best tracks from that. I recorded some new ones with a string quartet, which is what I really wanted to record with from the outset. So then I was starting to find my style, starting to find my voice, and I became myself then, because the first album I recorded under a group name called Midnight Rags, which was just I thought, if I call myself Paul Roland, people are going to think I'm a solo singer-songwriter like Don McLean or something, and not bother with me. I mean, in those days you couldn't do that, but post-punk. So I had to be a group. But
Yes.
by 1985, I could be myself, and that's when I started this whole sort of fantasy vibe and historical supernatural vibe, and I had this Victorian Edwardian setting, a musical setting, if you like, the violin, cello, and so on, me on acoustic guitar. And I think that's when the Syd Barrett comparisons started. Because Acid Tapes invited me to contribute a track to their Syd Barrett tribute albums. Were then the next fashionable thing. It's called Beyond the Wild Wood, and I did a version of Matilda Mother, and I think that did me a lot of good. Introduced me to a lot of people who wouldn't have heard me otherwise, because they obviously were fans of Barrett.
Yes.
And unfortunately, I didn't take them up on the offer to contribute to more of their. They had a whole series of tribute albums. The next one, I think, was to Captain Beefheart, because I was afraid that I wouldn't be taken seriously as a songwriter if I started to record all these cover versions. I didn't realise, as I do now, that would have done absolutely no harm. In fact, later I did a mini album of cover versions called Strychnine, which did me a lot of good also, because I didn't realise that the way I was reinterpreting these songs was quite imaginative or quite different. In fact, I did a Regency version, chamber orchestra and harpsichord version of Gary Gilmore's Eyes. So you take
Classic, yes, absolutely brilliant.
And thank you. And people thought how different and interesting it was, instead of just doing a Xerox copy. And I applied that idea, but not that instrumentation, obviously, to other tracks by the Velvet Underground, Susie and the Banshees, the Sonics, and so on. And that was a very successful thing. So I could have continued to have recorded my own songs and done cover versions, but at the time, that's the way I was thinking. You don't get too associated with cover versions, because people won't take you seriously as a songwriter. But that's established myself as a songwriter at the time, so I suppose that was a reasonable, stupid idea to have.
So when you did that album, Cabaret of Curiosities, did you sort of get a band together at that stage, or were you just using musicians when and if you needed them?
Yes, that was that was the full-blown chamber ensemble for the whole album, and I simply asked the studio to find me. I asked my arranger actually to find me classical musicians,
right,
to gather together for that project, and they did, and likewise for the follow-up, which was Happy Families. And only after that did I find a band to record Dance Macabre for Bam Caruso. But that only lasted for that one album, and then an already working band came to me and said, look, we'd like to work with you and play live. And I thought, well, and then I had invitations from Greece and Italy and so on, Germany, to play as a band. And having played as an acoustic duo on an acoustic trio just a couple of years before, mid-'80s, I then had the confidence to stand on a stage and play with a band. And the tours were arranged by my German label, which I had by then. And so, why wouldn't I say no? So that's how that happened.
Yes. So were you on New Rose Records in the UK?
Right.
And who were you with
in France? In France, New Rose.
And who were you with in Germany?
It was called Pastel at the time, Pastell, and they had the Shiny Gnomes and various other bands that I can't remember the name of. And they were a credible German indie label, getting good reviews, good radio play, and getting tours together. So I'd go away for a couple of weeks and play, virtually every night as a rock band, but still not knowing that I was, steampunk goth or anything else. It was just a rock band playing these sort of fantasy-themed songs, if you like,
Yes.
And we didn't attract a particular audience. In fact, initially when I went as an acoustic duo in '86, we attracted a mod audience because we were supporting a band called Direct Hits.
Oh, yes, I remember them.
Yeah. So I remember saying at the time, when do you think this '60s fad will end? Thinking, because I went to somebody's flat and there was, Parkers and all this kind of, this Who stuff around, all this memorabilia, and everybody was coming to the gigs on scooters and in Parkers, And I thought, well, this can't last very long. I don't think it did, but that. See, I didn't really know who I was. That's what I'm saying. I thought, I'm a singer-songwriter, and I'm playing with this. In fact, when I first played with the Dentists in Kent, I thought they were going to throw bottles at us. Why would they listen to an acoustic duo, for goodness sake? But they thought it was absolutely, they thought it was so bizarre. They didn't know what to do. And then they clapped afterwards and everything. So I thought, wow, in those days, in those just after punk, standing on a stage with an acoustic guitar, they would have lynched you, But they obviously liked the songs, regardless of how. And as somebody said, in fact, they were a member of Opal that I played with in Germany. I don't know if you remember Opal. John Roback, I think his name was. He used to be. Never mind. But they said, "Well, you sound like an Elizabethan trio." See, those sort of things wouldn't occur to me, but that's obviously the way the people heard me, as this, not a novelty act, but something very odd and very English and slightly eccentric. But the beauty, if I may say, of the songs and the lyrics, even see, the lyrics appeal to people whose first language wasn't English, which I thought very strange, particularly in Greece and Italy. In Germany, they learn English, in school, so that was different. But in those countries, they must have just got the idea that the song was about, a hanging judge or whatever, or the Great Edwardian Air Raid or whatever I'd written about. But they didn't necessarily understand all the words, but they got the gist from the title, and they got this feeling, going back to the emotion again, this feeling, this melancholic, lost past feeling from the music, and dare I say, the beauty of the tune, or whatever you want to call it, and then this peculiar setting, this peculiar presentation of me, acoustic guitar, and a viola, electric viola, and an electric violinist playing with me. That was the initial thing before the band, and so they took me as this strange English, what would you call it, artist.
Did you dress up as well? Did you play the part?
No, I didn't. No, you see, there was no cosplay at the time. That all came with steampunk much later. I think I had a leather jacket on and dark jeans. But my electric violinist looked like a punk. He had all sorts of chains. He had trouble getting through the airport because he had so many chains on his leather jacket, and he was as skinny as a rake, really emaciated. So he looked very striking. I looked like his manager, somebody said at one point, which I took as an insult, but I was the straight man, if you like, and he was the rock star, if you like, and yet he was playing an electric viola. So not an instrument you get every day, on the punk circuit in Germany. So that, I think that appealed to people.
Yes. So then as we crept into the 90s, was it Strychnine that was the one which has Venus in Furs,
Yes.
Arabian Nights, Too Much to Dream. So this was this project that you were bringing together, because this is with a bigger band, isn't it, at this stage?
No, I'd gone from the band that recorded Dance Macabre with me to this other, I won't call them ready-made band, but they were playing together and they offered to play with me. From it would have been Duel, I think, was the first one we would have done together, and we recorded several albums together and toured quite a lot together. And by the time it came to Strychnine in '92, I was tempted to do a covers album because it was the rage at the time, and mini albums were also, I think, still the rage. So I remember my then girlfriend saying to me, who was German, why don't you do album cover versions? You've done really interesting covers, like Gary Gilmore's Eyes on Cabinet of Curiosities and the Matilda Mother.
Yes.
So she persuaded me that it was the right time to do that. And I certainly had a yearning to record some songs that I particularly loved and wanted to do something different with them. That was the key. That was the criteria. I'd only record songs if I could do something different. It doesn't mean better, doesn't mean improving the originals, but it gives them a different character, different personality. So on Arabian Nights, for example, I did it as a duet with my flute player. I had a female flute player and vocalist. So we sang it as a duet. That gave it a different personality. I also think it extended it by a verse because it was too short, the Susie and the Banshees version. And we made it a bit heavier, so it wasn't so much punky as more, hard rock sort of thing with this Arabian flavour. I loved the song so much that I had to do it. And then there was Donovan's Guinevere, which the only thing I did there was I closed up all the gaps. He kept stopping after every verse or whatever it was, I can't remember. And I felt that killed the momentum. So I recorded it as a flowing song and added a hurdy-gurdy and some sort of pseudo-medieval instruments. And so I felt that had given it a different twist, if you like. I think, there was a Kevin Ayers Lady Rachel. Somebody else had recommended that song to me. I hadn't heard it before. I wasn't familiar with his songs, and I really liked that. But I felt I wanted to emphasize the medieval character that was in the song but wasn't in his original recording. So there were all these little touches, embellishments, changes of approach, if you like.
And who was your hurdy-gurdy player that you went to?
Oh, he was just a local folk guy. I mean, I'd started in a folk club in 1977, just as a local, what do they call it? Not like a stand-up spot or whatever, open mic spot or whatever you call it, where they had like famous guests like Bert Jansch would come and play, and then the local musicians such as myself would get up in the interval and play a couple of songs. So I'd known him from that, and I needed something, as I say, sort of medieval, and that was the closest I could find, a hurdy-gurdy, and that added a different flavour to it. So I'm always looking to embellish the songs, whether they're by myself or somebody else, bring out something different in them. Also to evoke the period. So if the lyric is medieval or fantasy or what have you, I like to use the instruments that would conjure that up. There's no point having a heavy guitar or a piano or whatever it happens to be, drums, and you're talking about a ghost walking in the woods. I mean, yes, of course you can use whatever you like, but if you want to really give that image into people's minds when they're listening, you have to create a soundtrack that's suitable. That's always been uppermost in my mind. It's not simply a track. It's not simply you're playing a song, but you're using suitable instruments to paint the picture. That's that's crucial to me.
Yes, my God. Were you still kind of interested and curious with what music was happening during that that particular period? Were you sort of keeping your finger on the
No, I'm
pulse?
afraid I have to disappoint you there. I was very mainstream, and I didn't have friends who introduced me to new music. I was very mainstream then. I was listening primarily to Mark Bolan, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, the usual suspects, Uh,
Right.
and I never got into seriously indie or obscure bands until much, much later, when people who listened to my music would suggest, as I said, with that Kevin Ayers track, oh, your music is like Peter Hamill. I remember one of them saying, why don't you listen to, you know, what was it? Never mind, not the Warlord in his armory or something. I remember it, or something like that. And they would point me towards specific songs, or the Strawbs, the Hangman and the Papist. I remember John's Story, A Bucket Full of Brains, recommending. So they would say, this sounds a bit like you. This sounds a bit like something you should be doing. And whether I recorded it or not, it pushed me into listening to the music. But remember, we didn't have the internet then. You had to go and find the blooming record,
Yes, this is true. The record library was king at that stage.
Oh, well, yeah, forget about the record library. They only had classical stuff. Now you had to go to, in fact, I remember, seeing as you mentioned it, I did go to all the way up from Kent to Croydon every week to get the Smiths and other albums from the record library because didn't have a lot of money and found them here. But it was fun anyway. You go up there, you get them, you bring them back, you take them, then you take them back, then you get another lot. And so yes, I did do that at that point, but it was very mainstream. I wasn't adventurous enough. To be honest, I was more interested in film. I think at that point in the early '80s, we had VHS and everything. I remember taping films that I hadn't seen before, classic horror movies and so on. There used to be a double bill every Saturday night in the summer, I remember. And you'd see Val Lewton and all this Universal stuff. And I was much more interested in the visual thing. I had enough music, I felt. I would still listen to the radio in those days. You could listen to Radio Caroline at night and hear some really decent stuff. All the great classic, Stairway to Heaven and Smoke on the Water, and even the American stuff like Freebird and all these sort of things. You didn't need to go and it was on tap. It was wonderful. It wasn't like streaming these days because you didn't know what they were going to play, but you knew they were going to play something interesting because you trusted them. They had a reputation. They only played great stuff. They might play some American AOR, which I hated, but there wasn't too much of that. And the next record would be something else, that you would like. And that was a wonderful time. You could lie in bed at night and listen for hours, and they wouldn't babble about stupid stuff. And they wouldn't have adverts that I don't remember, but it was pretty much your mates playing their record collection to you. So I suppose that was curious,
Yes. So then then you were from New Rose Records and then went to Gaslight Records.
No, Gaslight Records was me. No.
Right. So you started to so at that stage, was this kind of, did you finish your contract with them?
No, I never had a contract with it. Well, I had a contract album by album, I think, with labels. No, I simply accumulated these various labels. At one point, I released Duel in 1989 on 4 different European labels in the naive belief that each of them would service the radio stations and magazines in their own territory, which the others wouldn't have done if they'd simply imported, 50 copies. How could they? But what I didn't realize was that when they said, oh, yes, Paul, we promise to only distribute your album in our own country, that they wouldn't adhere to that promise. They would ship them to wherever they could sell them. And if one label had the album a week before the other 3 labels, they would ship them all out and spoil the whole business for the other 3. So that didn't really work out very well. But that was at a point when, I felt everybody wanted me. So I wouldn't. You don't say, no, you can't have my album. You think, great, it's going to be released in Greece or Italy or Germany.
Yes.
And you've got all your contacts with in fact, the German label, I remember, employed a PR company. So they got, national radio, the German national radio to play me and everything, and interviews and with the big magazines, the equivalent of Melody Maker that I wouldn't have got in the UK, never got, in fact. So, of course, I said yes to everybody. And only later found out, how annoyed they all were with me. But that was that time, and then things quietened down, and that's why I started Gaslight, because the others had all closed down. I can't remember what. I remember the Greek label found that they made more money from having heavy metal bands. They made a fortune from live gigs and festivals, and pressing up records was nothing compared to that. So they stopped their label, and of course that cut off a whole audience for me. You know, I lost that audience overnight because unless you're going there and playing gigs and being interviewed, you know, how are they going to, in those days, how would they, you know, find you? You know, they'd have to import an album. And so, okay, then we were still in the EU. They didn't have import duties. But, the Greek audience had to watch their money. They were in quite a poor state even back then, you know, when things were quite decent. So it was a difficult sort of time. And so I started my own label so that I wouldn't lose contact, so that I'd have control again. But it was quite a different world by then. And we're talking, what are we talking about?
Well, 94, I think. Was that your first release?
94, you're right. Saraband, 94, yes, that's right. I think it was my only. But I released Gargoyles as well, I think, after that, on my own label. But then after that, I took a 7-year retirement. In fact, I thought that was it, that I'd had my run. And I had 2 small boys, and my wife and I devoted ourselves to bringing them up. And I was writing a lot for music magazines. Then it was sort of classical magazines and film magazines. I was writing for major film magazines. And I enjoyed that. You know, I didn't really feel I'd lost anything. But then one day I was interviewed about my Kabbalah cards and photographed and everything. And for this whole professional photo shoot and all. And I thought to myself, you know, only a few years ago, this would have been about my music. And that was quite, I don't know, it had quite an effect on me. I felt, you know, is this the end? Is this what I'm going to be now? I don't want to be this. I don't want to write for magazines and not do music. But, you know, if there's no labels and nobody's inviting me, what can I do? And it was only shortly after that I was invited to perform at a goth festival in Berlin at a castle.
Right.
That was too tempting. So I hadn't got any instruments on it. I hadn't played for 7 years. So I had to learn my songs all over again. And that was interesting because then I heard them fresh as somebody else might hear them. And I thought, oh, these are actually quite good. And I could do more. So then I started to write. I remember I wrote Edgar Allan Poe, I think was the first song I wrote after those 7 years. And it wasn't so much the picking up a guitar as I had before, playing some chords and getting a melody and then thinking of a theme to fit it. I actually thought of the theme first. And I thought, in my mind, it would be a simple 2-note phrase, you know, Edgar Allan Poe. That would be the chorus. So it was an idea of the song, funnily enough, that got me going. And I picked it up and wrote that idea. But after that, you know, I would write in the same way. Though I tend to use, from that moment, I tended to use a little keyboard which had a drum machine, and that would stimulate ideas, because to play to a rhythm would put me in a particular frame of mind or into a particular, attitude, give me something to work with. That was very interesting. And then I plinked around on the keyboard. I thought, oh, you know, you don't have to be a pianist, a trained keyboard player to play, as long as you're okay with simple little phrases. And it was a bit like, you know, 20 years before when my friend or my father's friend had played the flute with me. I realized, you know, as long as you've got a nice chord sequence and you've got a nice melody, you only have to add a few little phrases, a little counter melody or something, and you've got something, you know. So that's when I didn't need the arranger anymore, and I started to work out my own arrangements and either play them on a keyboard with high quality samples so that you didn't know it was a keyboard, you know. It really did sound like a flute or a cello or whatever. And since then, I've been doing that more and more until I'm actually composing. I won't call it orchestral music, though I did a fantasy for orchestra called a Grim Fantasy. But I wrote recently a little chamber opera called Carmilla, you know, after the vampires novella by Sheridan Le Fanu. And I played all of those parts like a virtual orchestra. And I did an electronic album, which I never listened to electronic music, and I thought, how do you do it? How do you generate the music from a keyboard? But I learned how to do that, or I discovered it, and it was playing again. It goes right back to when I was 14. It's always the fun of playing. If I continued just strumming acoustic guitar, that might have been fine, and I'd continue writing songs. But I needed the stimulus of something different. So, in addition to playing the guitar and strumming and playing creating songs the way I've always done, I now have keyboards that at my disposal that I don't use as keyboards exactly, not in the way the Human League or somebody would use a keyboard. You would have used a keyboard. I use them to generate music, shall we say? But it has to sound. If I'm doing an electronic album like I did, and it's called the Anubis engine, it's a sort of Stargate concept. Then it's fine. It's all electronic because you're into space and Stargate and parallel universes. That's okay. But if I'm doing like the Carmilla Chamber Opera, I have to have sounds that you would think you would immediately assume were real cellos, real violins, real flutes. That's very important to me. I don't want to use little plinky plonky electronic things because that cheapens the music. I feel,
Yes. So what do you still call yourself, Paul Roland, at this stage with all these other projects?
Been Paul Roland. Except when I was Midnight Rags, yes.
Yes. So all this is under your name, so it's all easy to find.
Yes, on my back site.
So then the 90s was a sort of a period of sort of going, hibernating to then suddenly coming back into the music world again. So your enthusiasm never waned at this point, did it?
No, once I'd got over that, once I'd gone through that 7-year period, which I enjoyed writing for the music press very much so, and bringing up my children. So I was there every day for them. I didn't have to go away to work or anything. So I wouldn't change that for anything. But obviously, once I was invited back onto the stage for this Berlin Goth Festival in 2004, I think it was, I then thought, no, I want to get back into the studio and I want to be myself again. I want to be me again. That was very important. I hadn't been me. I'd been like a dead man walking, as I said to somebody. It really was odd. It's a bit like a painter or anybody else who's creative to suddenly be cut off, and for 7 years as well. But once I got back to it, and I found this other way of working, this new way where, again, there was a whole new palette of colours, a whole new possibility of how to make music, and that I was not dependent on anybody else. I do have a band now. In fact, I have two, one in Italy and one in England. But I am self-sufficient. I could stay up tonight and, in theory, and create a completely new thing, record it already presentable, all on my own without any additions. Because we have this technology now, which we didn't have before. Before you had to get real musicians in, and I still prefer that because I like working with people. I don't like to dictate to people.
Yes,
but it does have this whole play thing, which again means that it doesn't matter how old you are. It's not important. Nobody cares. If the music is valid, if the music has energy, if the music is full of ideas, if the music has a beauty to it, even if it's a horror theme, if it still has a beauty to it, then who cares? And it gives me a buzz to create it. It gives me a buzz then to go into the studio and recreate it if I need to, or to put it out, or to collaborate with people. Now that with the internet, the Anubis engine, I collaborated with a friend in Germany who was an electronic artist, and then I did the Mind Melt Machine EP with a Finnish space rock guy, Santu Laxo, who was known as Astral Magic, and I wrote a sort of Hawkwind type song and put some basic keyboards with it, and then handed it over to him, and he added drums and a violin and more keyboards, and it's just great fun. It's the way I did, played with music when I was 14, but now with more competence, and with people who I enjoy collaborating with. playing music. Really, that is the key word. It's playing, it's creating, it's having fun. And as long as it continues to be like that, I won't lose enthusiasm for it. But I might
Yes.
overstuff the market, but that's not my problem, is it?
No, it's not. It's not. Yes, that's not your fault. But then, were during this period of getting back into music, were you still managing to write various books and
Yeah.
publications and various?
I wrote about 50 books for major publishers on the esoteric and on true crime. And that was my living, if you like, because music didn't provide a living. But then I decided I wanted to write fiction. I wanted to write novels, and I stopped writing non-fiction for any of these publishers. And of course, music has taken off. I mean, in Italy, I've got a studio there. I've got musicians there, and I feel I want to use my time to the best advantage. Yeah, and because there's so many possibilities, why get diverted? Shall we say, writing a book for 3 months, which takes not only the daytime, but when you wake up at night, you're still thinking about the book. You have to give it all your time and energy. And I don't want to give a non-fiction book that is only of mild interest to me. I've said what I wanted to say in books about the esoteric and true crime and whatnot, and that was enjoyable up to a point. Although I had to write about the Nazis as well, and of course serial killers. So it was interesting up to a point. It was also quite upsetting when it got very serious. And I thought, I don't want any more of this. I've got kids.
No, well, I'm not surprised.
I don't want any more of that. So, as I said, I did 50 books and over I don't know how many years, and I felt that was enough. And now I'm at a certain age and with certain opportunities that I'd rather devote my energies to something original. And that's really what it was about. I wanted to, in fact, I did I've got an album in Cannes at the moment, which is based on Graham Greene's Brighton Rock.
Right.
So that took me all the time to read his book and turn his entire novel into verse, and then set it to music. Obviously, picking out highlights, and dropping certain characters. Otherwise, it'd be a triple album or something. But so I can indulge my whims and see how far they can take me, and if I can turn my sort of dreams, if you like, or into something real. And when I do, it's immensely gratifying, especially when you work with other people. So I have the possibility to take an album to a certain level all by myself, and then hand it over and have the band play certain things on it or re-record certain tracks that we feel that my demo was just showing them what was possible. And it's the best of every kind of world, and I think that's what's great about making music at the moment. With we've got digital multi-trackers. You can record at home. You can then take it to the studio and upload it and add things. You can record it at the studio, take that home, put things on the top. You can send things to any other country, and a collaborator who you just fancy making music with can say, "Oh, I'll add a vocal to that. I'll add a whatever instrument," and bingo, you've got so and so on it. And I think that's that's why I keep doing it, because it's never the same thing as it was. It's always something different that keeps your interest and enthusiasm. And the one last thing I would like to say is, what I do have to do is not pay any attention to reality. I mustn't let the facts get in, which is that only a certain amount of people like what I do or are interested. If you think about that, you stop. So I'm making music because I love doing it. And I love making music with other people. And I know that a certain amount of people like my music, but I don't need to know how many they are. I don't need social media feeding my ego or whatever. I'm doing it because I love it. And I don't want to know that somebody else has got, 100,000 likes on their track or whatever, or they're on 55 playlists. And, because if you get into that, you get very discouraged, disheartened and demoralized. And I don't think that that's not the world that I'm trying to appeal to anyway. I mean, if I wanted to, I would be a rap artist or something, wouldn't I?
Well, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So,
Or a female singer.
well, I think was it Simon Fisher Turner with Colin Lloyd Tucker? They sort of invented these two characters that were
Oh,
French women, and they put an album
oh,
out which was highly regarded and critically acclaimed, but people really thought it was two French women. They put a whole backstory
oh.
and invented it, and then realised that actually people had really gone along with it. So eventually they had to come out and say, actually, it was us. But they did well. They did well with it. So with your on the sort of, you did obviously, you mentioned esoteric books, and the Third Reich, obviously, but then was it three on Mark Boland you've done?
4, actually, I think it was. Yes. I was trying to get it right. I mean, the first one I did when I was, a kid in short trousers. I said it was a scissors and paste job, as they called it then. You cut out the quotes and you wrote in between them. So that wasn't a
Yes.
legitimate book. And then about 20 years later, after I'd written a lot of non-fiction books, I felt, now I am a writer. I'll do justice to this artist that I've respected and admired and has influenced me. So I wrote a proper biography, but it was with my journalism came into there, and I was a bit overcritical with Bolan, and so I thought I'd better write another book that just tells you why I admire him and cut out the criticism. So I wrote that, and also described the albums more eloquently. So I felt that was the better book. That was Metal Guru. That's the one I'm proud of, and it was translated into Italian. And then I think did I do? No, I don't think that's
You did
it.
Cosmic. There was one called Cosmic Dancer.
Well, that was the one that I. Sorry, that was the one that I did when I became a proper writer, and I did that for a small publisher. And I felt that was too critical. So then I rewrote that completely, and that was Metal Guru, and that was also published as Bolan Boogie in Italy.
Oh,
so that's how
so,
we get 4.
right, okay. Did
I'm
you feel
done now.
Did you feel quite guilty when you'd sort of been so aware of Mark Boland at that stage?
Sorry, what do you mean? Did I feel guilty?
Well, when you did a book and were quite critical, did
Oh,
you?
that yes. People were obviously fans. Fans can't take criticism of their heroes, so I knew it was partly that. But I did see that they had a point. That what somebody said was, you might not like that particular track, but I happen to like it. Well, I saw that was a fair point. So then somebody else who was in fact the translator for the Italian book said, why don't you just make it why you love Mark Bolan's music and leave all the journalistic criticism out of it. So I did, and it was a better book for it. Let other people come up with the criticism, if you like. I would also be very careful and say things like, well, some critics might say, and then you could have some criticism in there, but I wouldn't say, I think that track is weak or something, because that's asking for trouble. They can't take.
But it's interesting you said that, because I know Lou Reed. There was a writer called Chris Roberts, when he was interviewing Lou, who was feeling quite irritated at the time, I guess. Made comments like, "Well, this started well, but it's going downhill," to the interviewer. But then but when I think it was Chris said something like, "People have said," and he said, "Well, who said that? Who said that? Give me their names."
Yes.
So I kind of think because I've met people say, a lot of people are saying blah, 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 which was some criticism to me. But
Yes.
then it's like, well, could you just tell me, are we talking 2 people? And who are these people, by the way? Because if it's this person, I'm not going to be that interested. And I'm not surprised because they don't like me.
Yes.
So in a way, I think it's more honest to say this is how I feel, rather than I've heard it from the grapevine.
No. If I said, no, I was saying some critics might say this about this album. So I wasn't saying somebody had said it. And that, because I knew that it was a touch, they were very, what's the word? Well, very touchy, about any kind of criticism. You couldn't, even his later albums, which were absolute crap, you couldn't say that but I felt very disappointed as a fan that he had he had neglected his talent. He had veered off and was doing these trite little, hey little girl, let me hold your hand lyrics, which he was. That's undisputable. But they criticized me for even saying that. So I would couch my criticism by saying some critics might say that he, and I covered myself, but I still made the point.
Yes, yeah, yeah. I did like one song he did in '77, which "The Soul of My Suit." Would you say that was medium to poor or just crap?
Poor. No, that's poor. I wouldn't say it was crap, but it was. It was lazy. You see, this is why I made those criticisms, because I felt this is a person who had an incredible talent, facility for words, and he made these beautiful acoustic albums before he was famous, with Tyrannosaurus Rex.
Yes.
And then he had this sort of bubblegum rock 50s rock revival phase with Electric Warrior and less so the Slider, more bubblegum there. And then Tanks, where he used, other instruments and was, expanding his color palette, if you like. But after that, he got into Cosmic Soul with these this colored girl singers and funk, and it got into the Prince territory long before Prince was around. And he lost me there. And from there, it went even worse. But that's because he was using a lot of cocaine and stuff, So why should I lose my critical faculties as a fan and say this is still wonderful because anything he does is wonderful? That's what his mum would say, If you're a fan, you say, I love him because of this, and I'm very disappointed because he's no longer doing that. I don't expect him to be the same all the time and to keep producing these things when time has moved on. But he's selling himself out because he wants to be famous, not because he wants to make great music anymore. And he was pandering to a teenage audience, and he was cheapening his music, and I had to say so. You have to be careful how you say it, obviously, because certain people like when I wrote a Lovecraft book, you couldn't dare criticize Lovecraft because they're absolute fanatics. These people, and so you also can't tell them what they already know because they know everything already, But I wrote the Lovecraft biography to get slightly off the subject because his main biographer, had written like 3 bloody volumes, and there were 1,500 pages. I don't want to read Lord of the Rings about Lovecraft. I want a brief, succinct biography saying why he was special and quoting some of his texts, so you get a flavour of his language and the essence of his stories. So that's why I wrote The Curious Case of H.P. Lovecraft. And got kicked in the teeth for it because these people said, yes, but you haven't said what he had for breakfast and you haven't said what his favourite colour was. Well, it's not important, is it? His life was about writing fiction. This is what he's known for. His religious views, his political views, which he was a racist, by the way, which I managed to get that in. I wasn't going to ignore that. But other than that, we're not really that interested in all these articles he wrote about, politics and so on. We can sum that up very quickly. If you're a real writer, you sum these things up. You learn to be succinct and concise. Yeah, you don't go on and on and on because you just lose the casual person. And there are enough casual people who just want to know what is the basic story of H.P. Lovecraft, his biography, what's special about what he wrote, and give me a flavour of what he wrote. Cover all his important things, and I covered absolutely everything he ever wrote, but not in enormous detail, just enough. In fact, I thought it was very satisfying that you got the right balance, and if you want more, well, there's your 3-volume Lord of the Rings by if you really want it,
Did you never feel tempted with the Crowley then? Did that, that must have been slightly on your mind?
Was I tempted
to write a book about Aleister Crowley?
No. I felt he was a real charlatan. He was a dangerous character. I didn't want to endorse his beliefs by writing about him. From my own esoteric experiences, I knew that what he was doing was unethical. He was putting in traps for the unwary in his books because he was an egotist. He felt, I know the truth. I know all the secrets. I'm not going to share them with you. I'm going to publish some of my practices, magical practices, and those who know as much as I do will know when there's a trap. Yeah, and they'll right. But that's not the way a genuine spiritual teacher behaves. Yes, that's unethical. You don't lure people into a trap and say, "Ha ha, you fool! I got you." The rest of you, you're all as clever as me, and you can skip over that trap. Yeah, that is irresponsible, and particularly with esoteric work. Can you imagine how dangerous that is? You're messing with people's minds. You're messing with a psychological balance. So I thought he was a dreadful person, as much as he might have known. That's no excuse for seeing Kabbalah. We were very responsible for the well-being of our students, if you like, and our readers. We guide them along a safe way. We explain things clearly, and we say one key phrase is, "It is my understanding that." In other words, you don't tell them this is a fact. You say, "It is my understanding that this is the case." Yes. In other words, you're saying, I believe this, but you might not. Why don't you try something, and then you will know for yourself whether it's true or not. This is how a true spiritual teacher guides their followers, their pupils, or what have you, their students. But this Crowley thing was, well, it was just typical of the man, because he was a complete egotist and a charlatan. But as I say, he certainly knew a lot. He was an adept, but in the end, with all his indulgences and drugs and whatnot, he ended up frightened of the dark, which is why I wrote that song about him. Very sort of wistful, whimsical, making fun of him, if you like, because he is such a pompous character. He needed his character, his ego pricked, if you like. And the same with Montague Summers. There's another sort of unethical Victorian occultist who I wrote about. People who like to put one over on the gullible, if you like, and exploit them, and who also had very cranky, weird beliefs and so on. And they are on the periphery of the esoteric and the occult. They're not true spiritual teachers, So I think they deserved a good kicking, No give on that.
Yes. So coming back to your recordings and live shows, have you got dates coming up anytime soon? Or
yes, I've just been to Italy at the beginning of March and played 2 gigs. I'm going back on July the 31st to play another couple, and then we should be going to Prague and maybe Germany, maybe Greece at some point. But I don't know. I was thinking of retiring only a couple of years ago. In fact, I did announce my retirement, and then I had to come back. So it's a bit like what's his name, Al Pacino in the Godfather, or something. I thought I was out of this, and they pulled me back in. Yeah.
Yes, and on the album front, you did Mockingbird Lane, The White Worm, and Weird Tales. Has there been any other albums since then?
Yes, there was. After Weird Tales, what was there? Oh, Morbid Beauty. Morbid Beauty was a group album that came out on a UK indie label called Blue Matter, which was actually Bevis Fron's own label. That came out last September, and it's also being released in America shortly on a small American label. And it's the first American release I've ever had, actually. And that is a very strong album, if I can say that. It's a group album. Quite psychedelic, but not too trippy. I tend to have a good solid rock base to even my psychedelic stuff.
Yes,
and there's some even sort of rockabilly slant in there, and an epic monster track called Godzilla. So it's different again, but not too different. As some people have said, they and I can't name them, so don't ask me who said it. There seems to be a consistent theme to my work, even though each album is different. They're not that different that you can't get your head around it, can't relate it to me, and yet they're different enough to say, he's going in other directions, but it's still Paul Roland.
Yes, a beautiful cover. Who designed this?
I think Nick Salomon himself, Bevis Frond, found the illustration. It's a sort of Beardsley type, but it's not by Beardsley. And I just asked him to add that yellow colour in there because I'd seen that in something else. So we did that between us very, very quickly. We didn't mess about much. We both knew what we wanted, and hopefully he's going to keep me on the label because I'm one of the easiest people to work with. I don't haggle much.
So morbid. So, and then did you say what's the next album coming out after that, or is that just to be?
No, that should be Brighton Rock, the one I mentioned. That's very different, and I don't think Blue Matter would release it because there's no psych element to it. It's more like the Who or the Small Faces. It's quite 60s. I mean, it has to be. It's about a criminal gang in 1930s Brighton.
Yes.
It's more Quadrophenia than it is Piper at the Gates of Dawn.
That's amazing. I mean, you've got this colossal amount of work. Have you got any kind of archived or sort of, have you catalogued it all and
I don't need to catalogue it. I mean, and to me, it doesn't seem such a great amount. I mean, it's only 25 albums. And I had 7 years off, and before that, I had the other 3 years off. That's 10 years I haven't been. Imagine how many albums I would have done if I hadn't stopped.
Yeah, but there is a lot of records.
No, come on. It's just, well, it's like anybody. It's as easy as writing a letter to me almost, or having a conversation. It's not something I struggle to do. I mean, I'm very grateful about that. Because it's this fun thing, and I think other people would be more prolific if they were less intense about it, more easygoing or whatever you want to call it. You just pick up an instrument and strum something and get some chords together and away you go. If that doesn't work for you, there's a keyboard. Try pressing a few buttons there and away you go. And I'm always looking for interesting. It's ideas, you see, that start or are at the core of any concept. I don't write a song without an idea behind it, whether it's sympathy for a character, whether it's some story maybe by H.G. Wells or something or Lovecraft I might have read that gets. See, feeding your mind all the time is what's really important. Whether it's watching films, and I'm not talking about mainstream popcorn things which don't have much of an idea, but something with an idea, something that's moving, something that touches you, can spark, a novel or short story, a musical project, or even just a song, or mishearing something. We were once traveling in Germany. I mean, you were mentioning the C86 cassettes at one point, and I heard the TV personalities, How I Learned to Love the Bomb, but I'd misheard it, and I thought he sang, Here I Am in Another Home. So I thought, that's a great idea. Here I am in a mental home, in a sanitarium. When I found out he hadn't sung that gave me the choice to do it. So I wrote the next morning on a little organ when we were on tour, Madhouse, which was on Cabinet of Curiosities. Here I am in another home. So all the time, if you're open to these things, you mishear something, you watch something interesting, you read something. I'm always reading. It's not so much listening to music, which is what would have spurred me to write music. So I think a lot of people that they're only listening to music or watching films to produce more films or more music, or reading books to write more. But if you cross these boundaries and read and watch and listen and all these, you're bound to get stimuli, for other things. So I'm not somebody who's jaded or feel that I've done it all already, or I'm repeating myself, or I'm extending something beyond its natural thing. As long as I feel, well, it's partly because I've invented my own world. I've given myself a very broad genre to work in, anything that's sort of fantasy, anything that's historical, anything that's supernatural. Okay, I can't go back and do more Victorian murderers unless it was a concept album and there were 12 of them, because I've done Dr. Cream and so on. But, look, I mean, I've got a house full of books. There are so many ideas to still get through. I just hope I live long enough to do another 25 albums.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, just kind of curious. I mean, what's your go-to, if you were to say, "Oh my God," David just asked me, my favorite, say your favorite three, I don't know, films that you would go back to or enjoy watching or think, yeah, that one still holds up after all these
There are
decades.
so many, but off the top of my head, I'd have to say number one would be The Draftsman's Contract, the Peter Greenaway art house murder mystery set in the 17th century with music by Michael Nyman. That was
Yes.
number one. Or there's so many. I mean, I love so many foreign language films. Um, cool. I couldn't even start to think. There's so many. Um, I mean, Orson Welles is one of my favourite directors. So probably The Magnificent Ambersons might be another one, and then either something by Val Lewton. I Walk with a Zombie, or a Universal horror. Horror. What was it? House of Frankenstein was one that the very first one I saw. I was lying in hospital recovering from, I think, what was it called? Not tonsillitis, the other one.
Appendicitis.
Appendicitis. Sorry, I was about 11 or something, and I went to the TV room at night, and the only fright I got from that was when the doctors kept coming in to check up on me. I jumped every time. "You're all right in here, son?" "Yes, yes, I'm fine. I'm just watching this horror movie." And it was beautiful. It was black and white. I watched it at night. All the lights were out, except you see the lights across the way in the other wards. And that was a profound experience. So even though it's not a great movie, that is something that is a favourite of mine. It has this dreamlike quality, House of Frankenstein.
Yes.
And it doesn't have to be a great art house statement. It can be something like that. A Victim with Dirk Bogarde is another favourite of mine.
Right.
I love black and white movies. I think Dirk Bogarde was a tremendous actor. In fact, I've read all his books as well. A wonderful writer, very eloquent, very erudite. Um, he had a quality, just small movements of his face, small movements of his eyes, and you felt, he really believed what he was saying. He was genuine. He wasn't performing. He was living the character. So
Yes.
anything by him. Well, he made some rather sort of naff movies as well. That's true, but many of his films are certainly watchable.
Yes, and sort of any books that you particularly, your sort of books that you think, God, they just, I go back to them every time, or they've had a profound influence on your life.
Okay. Well, M.R. James, not to be confused with Henry James, who the American writer who I find very dry, even though he wrote Turn of the Screw. Montague Rhodes James, who wrote wonderful ghost stories, all short stories. The language is wonderful, the atmosphere is wonderful, and they really get under your skin. Very atmospheric, and yet not obvious at all. In fact, they're quite of their own genre, if you like. They're quite unique. They're nothing like Lovecraft, nothing like any of the other famous ghost story writers. Um, that would be one I would read many times. Dirk Bogarde's autobiographies I reread, particularly Snakes and Ladders, which covers his early cinematic career, his entry into the Rank Organisation, and right up to Visconti's Death in Venice. That's a wonderful book that I've read more than once. Others, I still haven't read Lord of the Rings, I must admit, so I'm not a Tolkien fan.
Yes.
I also happen to like, to come to number three, several contemporary female writers who write in a Victorian style. Sarah, I'm not sure if her name is White or Sarah Smith, I think. She did Fingersmith, is one of her books. And I love Daphne du Maurier. In fact, quite a lot of them are female. I don't know why. There's a couple of American. Oh yes, P.D. James,
Right.
crime writer. I'm not a great fan of Agatha Christie, but P.D. James. Again, it's usually the language that I like, the description, the world. I'm not interested in the mystery. I don't care who killed who and how, but I like to savor the language. And H.G. Wells was probably my first love, if I can call it that. Wells had a wonderful style, very eloquent, very. He would conjure up the Edwardian world and then put something strange into it. Obviously, War of the Worlds, The Invisible Man, all those books. You had this cozy world that's long gone, and then you put these strange creatures or people into it, and that's always been fascinating for me. The stranger who turns up in a little village, all covered in bandages, it's a wonderful image for me. So Wells rather than Poe, Wells rather than Lovecraft, always. M.R. James, and then some of these women writers. The lady who wrote, well, she wasn't a lady. The woman who wrote, she was another racist. The one who wrote Strangers on a Train. Name escapes me for the moment. And she also wrote the series of books that Matt Damon acted in. God, all these things escape me at the moment. It's getting a bit late at night.
Oh, is that Patricia Highsmith?
Highsmith, that's right, yes. And as I say, there's contemporary writers like, I think it's Sarah Waters, is it? Or Waters?
Right, yes.
So, yeah, people who have a gift, an eloquency with language, who really make you feel you're eating a banquet of words, not just being told a story. Somebody, as I say, it's a pleasure to read a page,
Yes.
With what happens next or any of that at all. It's just a wonderful use of language. It's musical. I think that's what it is. That they all, in one form or another, use paint with words, and they have this modulation in their language. They choose words that they probably don't even, consciously think about the choice of words most of the time. It simply flows out of them. It's like, as I say, it's like music. It's just, it goes from minor to major and modulates, and it's just, and when you're reading, it's like listening to music, except it happens to be words. I think that's the key to it.
Yes.
So, why it appeals to me, I should say.
Excellent. Well, look, Paul, thank you ever so much for your time. This has been still mind-blowing after all. And I absolutely just love discovering your work. There's so much to sort of get excited by and nestle down. And obviously, it's really lovely to tune into your amazing catalogue. And also,
I forgot one thing. Sorry, I forgot the box set. You asked me what albums. That's only just come out. That's got the Carmilla Chamber Opera. It's got the Anubis Engine electronic album. I can always send this off to you as a WeTransfer. It's got the M.R. James album, which is all extended narrative songs, as I call them, based on M.R. James's short stories. And then it's got a CD of unreleased songs as well. So that's what's actually currently out at the moment.
Right.
It's called Paul Roland's Macabre Box of Musical Curiosity.
Snappy title. God, that's amazing. Well, yes, if you do have a WeTransfer, it'd be incredible. Because I would love to, play some more on the show. But yes, you've done just such a lot of stuff. And the other, you've got your websites, and also Bandcamp's the other place, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Paul-Roland, bandcamp.com, yes.
Yes. Well, look. Well, Paul, I'll let you rock on. But looking forward, do you ever play in England, by the way? Do you ever have any live?
To be honest, I have been invited to play at the Innsmouth Literary Festival on September the 27th. I think it's in Bedford. Could it be? It's somewhere up north. I can't remember. But if you Google it, you'll find out. I can't remember. I think it's Bedford. It can't be Bradford. I know it begins with a B. The Innsmouth Literary Festival, September the 27th. I'll be playing a solo acoustic set and probably reading some Lovecraft, because obviously it's a Lovecraft-themed festival.
Yes, well, good luck on that.
Thank you.
But yes, it'll be fantastic. But look, thank you ever so much for your time. And yeah, if you do have able to send me that link, or that would be fantastic. But yes, lovely to speak to you. And
Thank you very much for your interest.
it's oh God,
You're
I'm
patient.
fascinated. I try. But look, I'm going to go to bed now. But take care.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Take care and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. And that, dear listener, is the end of the interview. As you probably gathered, a massive thank you to Paul Roland for giving me the time for that. This has been the C86 show, David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can. Just go to any of those social media platform sites and just do C86 show. Put my name in if you really want to make sure. And yes, I've done lots of interviews. You can find those on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. And yes, fill your boots. Anyway, have a great week. Stay safe.